Okay, guys, we unfortunately had to left our meeting for internet problems, so we left off around here. And we're talking about the heart circulation, which is is a simple and complex at the same time. In the sense that, of course, it's very precisely regulated and it happens in such a wonderfully synchronized way. And as I was telling you, this is the result of millions of years of evolution because this is the most perfect heart and functional heart that evolution could have produced so far. We're talking about the chambers. Remember, the chambers that are superior are the atria, and the ones that are inferior are the ventricles. And remember that, so the atria and the ventricles, remember that to orient yourself, you could orient your heart, which one is the right, which one is the left. The left is always this part where you see the thicker wall of the ventricle. And or you could also take as a reference this portion of the heart where it narrows a little bit, it narrows out. So we said that the atria are receiving chambers and ventricles are pumping chambers. We can say they squeeze blood upward. And we have to be, I'm going to show you very many diagrams to make sure you understand how the circulation works. And so, first of all, we know that there are two, we can look at the circuits of the blood circuits in terms of gases, okay? So there is unoxygenated, or we can say CO2 rich blood that obviously comes from the body, and we call that systemic, right? We were defining that. So we can call it systemic circuit, which transports unoxygenated blood. The systemic circuit that transports oxygenated blood to all the tissues, the cells of the body. And we can talk about pulmonary circuit. Here we're talking about circuits relative to the body, not necessarily relatively to the gases that are transported. But the pulmonary circuit transports blood to and from the lungs. And of course, when it transports blood to the lungs, we're talking about unoxygenated. When it comes from the lung, we're talking about oxygenated blood. And so the systemic circuit transports oxygenated blood to the cells, but also the systemic circuit will transport the deoxygenated or CO2 rich blood from the whole body, all the cells. And that's where here we can follow the course of what happens. Now you can really start wherever you want. This is a circulation. I have also some very schematic representations of how the blood circulation works. But the trick is that you have to consider that this heart really in reality is two hearts that are working in parallel. One half of the heart is dedicated to unoxygenated blood and the other half is dedicated to oxygenated blood. That's how I see things really here happening. And so the blood that is rich in CO2 that comes from the systemic circulation, it will come to the heart through, and it will, we will name these big vessels here that are coming out the blood. But you can already see this one is the superior vena cava, where that collects all this blood, and the blood arrives into the right atrium. That's the first receiving chamber. I mean, the first one we're going to look at because you can really start the circulation from wherever you want. It's a circulation. There is no beginning or end, really. It's you decide where you want to start from. And the unoxygenated or carbon dioxide rich blood obviously needs to be sent to the lungs, and in order pump to the blood to the lungs in order to be oxygenated. And so the atrium is just a receiving chamber, and so from the atrium, the right atrium, the blood flows down with a small not so strong pumping, really, because it only has to travel a very short distance. Ends up into the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle, which is a pumping chamber, which doesn't have super thick walls, because now the blood has to be, the unoxygenated blood or carbon dioxide rich blood needs to just reach the lungs, which are pretty close by, right? And so through this big other vessel here, okay, is pumped to the lungs, and here there is a tract here is known as pulmonary trunk, that then subdivides into the left pulmonary arteries here and the right pulmonary arteries over there. Remember, we have two lungs, left and right, so obviously there is left and right pulmonary arteries. Okay, so once then the blood, imagine, has gone to the lungs, and now it has to come back to the heart, because now it has to be pumped very energetically to the systemic circulation. And so it comes back here to the receiving chamber, which is going to be the left atrium in this case, okay? And the vessels that it comes through are the left and pulmonary veins. And I want to point out here how the terms artery and vein here really refers to the direction of the blood. So the blood that leaves the heart leaves through arteries, and blood that comes back to the heart comes back through veins. We have this concept, which is correct but partially correct only, where we say, okay, the arteries transport oxygenated blood and the veins unoxygenated blood. If you look at this scenario, this is not true, because you have arteries transported blue, unoxygenated, and veins transporting oxygenated blood. So this scenario is inverted, it's not true. So when you define veins and arteries, if you want to be very precise, you'll just define them based on the directionality of the blood. And so the blood that transported through the vessels that leave the heart are arteries, and the blood transported by the vessels that come to the heart are veins. So if you define it that way, you are comprehensive. Or you can say arteries and veins transport respectively oxygenated and unoxygenated blood, at the exceptions of the ones that are in direct contact with the atria and of the heart. And so if you say it that way, that's correct too. So keep that in mind. All right, so now we're talking about the heart that has been oxygenated in the lungs, coming back to the heart through the left pulmonary and right pulmonary veins. Remember, there is always a left and right. And then from there, the blood is pumped into the left ventricle now. That has very, very thick walls. And the reason why it has thick walls is because now it has to be pumped through the whole body to the tip of your toes, and so it has to be pumped very strongly, and so it is pumped through this huge aorta here that is leaving now. It's in connection with the left ventricle. The blood leaves and there is an arch that forms, and this vessel, this aorta, forms an arch. Is called aortic arch, and now it can basically go to the whole systemic circulation. Okay, so it's easier than you think. I have more diagrams, and so we're gonna watch more diagrams, repeat this so that it's clear what's happening here. Now, you may have noticed all this, you start noticing all these structures here. What are these white things here? What are these things here? And so, so we have to look at what's happening there, because if you didn't have a system where there would be closure of certain openings between the chambers here that we're talking about, then the heart will be completely inefficient. So, and I have an animation that I suggest you to watch over and over, because if you watch it over and over, you'll understand what's happening. Here there is something that is happening in seconds. All what I'm describing is happening in seconds. And so by watching that, probably you'll have an idea of what happens, and everything here has to happen so synchronized. Okay, so those that we're describing here that actually are in between the chambers, between the atrium and the ventricle, both the right and the left, these are valves. They're really valves. They can be open or closed depending on what's happening. These are known as atrioventricular valves, AV valves, but they also have specific names, as we will see. And then there are valves here that regulate the blood directionality of the blood flow, really. Here in the aorta that I was talking about, the huge aorta that makes the arch, and this is known as aortic semilunar valve. But also there is valve here, okay, in a pulmonary vein, that is the pulmonary semilunar valve. And regarding the atrioventricular valves, going back to them, here they're already named here. The one that is in between the right and the right atrium and ventricle is the tricuspid valve. Tri stands for three, also it has three sections to it. Whereas the one that is in between the left atrium and ventricle is bicuspid valve, and bi means two, so it has two components to it. Okay, so let's go and look at these valves more in a better way. And so here is a view from the top, okay, of these valves. This is the tricuspid valve, which is the right atrioventricular valve. And then this is the bicuspid. You see that has only two, bi because it has two flaps to it. Here there are three, 1, 2, and 3. That's why it's tri. And bicuspid valve is also known as mitral valve, actually more commonly probably known as that. And the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves we can look at them, have three components to it, three flaps to them, okay, as shown here. Semi-lunar is half-moon valves. Here's another beautiful representation of the heart. And you may also notice how these valves that are present here, the atrioventricular valves, this white material here, they're really little tendons that kind of anchor them to the walls of the heart, as you can see here. So let's explore these atrioventricular valves in a better way. First of all, remember there are these are known as chordae tendinae. They are like little tendons, really, that, if you will, this kind of like fibrous connective tissue that keep them in place. And so let's see what's happening here. The blood that is returning to the heart here is not represented with the right colors. This is just an arrow, okay? Don't take it as the blood, the gas, that doesn't indicate the gas that is in the blood. But the blood returning to the heart fills the atria, and this could be either the unoxygenated or oxygenated blood, depending on which atria we're considering. And this puts pressure against the valves and that are forced to open. So it's the blood itself that coming back puts a pressure, and because of the shape also of these, of course, the way they're shaped and the fact that they're anchored, these valves open. But as the ventricles fill up, what happens is that now the pressure that starts building up in the ventricle, and they start filling up, and so as the ventricle starts contracting, they force the blood against the caps or the flaps of the atrioventricular valves. That then, see how now this is this is a ventricle filled with blood, and now the blood itself that pushes against them creates a pressure to where now the flaps close up. You want those flaps to close up because now the blood has to be directed into the vessels, the big vessels that are connected connected with the ventricles, and depending on, of course, which circulation you're talking about. Okay, for instance, let's go back here to our circulation picture. It's a little bit busy here, but obviously see how now when you pump the blood from a ventricle into here, if it's unoxygenated, this will be the pulmonary artery, or into the aorta. Now you want to close the communication between the atria and the ventricle, otherwise the blood would flow back in there. So that's absolutely important that you close those openings, those doors, so that now all the blood needs to be pumped into the vessels that are in connection with the ventricles. Okay, so that's beautifully architectured, and I want to talk about something that you may encounter in your career, known as mitral valve prolapse. It's the most common cardiac valvular anomaly that is mostly presented in human population, affects from 1 to 2.5% of the human population. And this condition is caused by the fact that the flaps, this mitral valve also has two flaps of the mitral valve, don't close smoothly or evenly at the same time, but create a prolapse, which is a bulging upward into the left atrium. And therefore this creates problems. Now, most of the time really is just the body can cope with this, but in some cases can be more, can create more complication, can create some sort of leakage, or this is also known as regurgitation, and this can actually even create serious problems of heart attack or stroke and death. The mitral valve prolapse is also known as Klick-Marmor syndrome or Barlow syndrome. So you'll find these names used interchangeably. All right, so now let's look at the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are the ones that are present here between, at the exit of the blood from the ventricles, okay? And so obviously when ventricle contract, of course you want that these flaps of the semilunar valves open up, because the blood has to flow out, as shown here. And therefore, and it's the blood and the pressure of the blood itself that forces them to open. But as the ventricle relaxes now, you don't want that the blood falls back in the ventricle. You want the blood to go where it needs to go, whether it is systemic circulation or it's pulmonary circulation. And so, because of the shape of these valves, as blood is pushed out from the ventricles, the blood itself here that is in this vessel now, it kind of creates a pressure on the other, from the other direction, so that those cups here fill up and close. So it's the blood itself, the blood flow itself, that creates the opening or the closure of these semilunar valves. So it's very clever. And here, this is the one animation that I really want you to watch over and over again, as many times as you need. And especially in this one, I want you to focus on what's happening here with the blood, okay? This one feels pumped out. And obviously, it's very hard to look at what's happening all together. You will have to probably focus on the blue or the red circulation, which is the unoxygenated and oxygenated. Okay, so look at it as many times as you need. And obviously here, all this yellow part here, that is what's happening here. We haven't talked about that yet, but we'll talk about that in a minute. All right. Here, I just want you to focus on the circulation, what fills up, and what's happening with the valves. Look at the valves. Okay, it shows you very nicely here the valves that open and close, that should be, as I just described. So all this very long discussion of blood circulation, what fills up, where it comes from, where it goes to, and the valve opening and closure is something that is very fast. It seems tedious, but if you understand the concept, you should be able to describe it pretty easily. Okay, so, and this is another picture, again, that shows the blood flow, okay? And I like this one because it's more comprehensive. It shows you all the right, for instance, the right and left pulmonary veins. Many other pictures, they omit one, especially the right one, okay? And then it shows you the right and the left pulmonary arteries as well, the aorta, and we talked about the whole blue and red circulation. I call it blue and red. I should say deoxygenated, oxygenated circulation. And there is another picture again here, and I may ask you, for instance, in the test to name this one for me, or this one, or this one. So obviously, you know, I could give you this exercise to do in the test. So you need to know all the names, okay? Understand how to name all these arteries and veins that generate from the heart, because the aorta is so super important, okay? And again, the left and right pulmonary arteries, what kind of blood they transport, in which direction. Of course, pulmonary is always referring to the lungs. And the left and pulmonary veins, what kind of blood they transport, and the directionality of it, and where do they, in which direction, and what is the receiving chamber for these veins. And don't get confused between artery and vein here. Remember that artery and vein here are different than the rest of the body in terms of the type of blood that they, of course, they transport, okay, as I told you before. And here is just a diagram. I like this one because it really shows you how in reality you really have two hearts, right? You have the blue and the left side of your heart, and the blue and the red side of your heart, and which are the right and the left, because remember the whole right portion of your heart deals with blue or unoxygenated or carbon dioxide rich blood, where the left deals with the oxygenated one. And then you can schematically represent the circulation. The unoxygenated blood ends up in the right atrium, gets to the right ventricle, gets pumped through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. Here there is no right and left, it's just a schematic thing, where then it gets oxygenated, and then from the lungs comes through the pulmonary veins, gets to the left atrium, the receiving chamber, then to the left ventricle, and that's where it's pumped systemically. And you can say this is your pulmonary circulation, this is your systemic circulation, which contains both the oxygenated and unoxygenated circulation, okay? So you cannot distinguish those two. They're happening both together. All right, so you can also talk about oxygen rich or poor blood. That's many times how it's defined. All right, so hopefully the circulation is clear to everybody. You have to visualize it, you have to practice on it. It's logical. You can't, you cannot send to the lungs blood that is already oxygenated. Why would you do that if you were Mother Nature, right? You cannot send to the systemic circulation unoxygenated blood or oxygen poor blood, right? You would send oxygen rich blood. So it's logical, okay? Now when I talk about the pericardium, this is something we talked in MP1. The pericardium is a sac, is an envelope, is a membrane that surrounds the heart, right? And let's look at this picture here. The pericardium has two distinct sublayers. Has the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. So the fibrous pericardium is the wall, okay, the very external wall. And then there is the serous pericardium here with and the serous pericardium has the two components to it, really. There is the visceral layer and there's the parietal layer. Remember we talked about all these membranes, body membranes and cavities, okay? This is a cavity, and we talked about this already, that has, in the cavity has liquid. So the heart, like other organs in our body, is actually contained in a cavity, which is known as pericardial cavity, that contains a fluid. So it is kind of suspended in this fluid, and that's a layer of protection there. And to surround this cavity rich with fluid, there is your pericardium. And the pericardium, pericardium is the subdivided into the visceral layer, which is the layer that is in direct contact with the heart itself, and the parietal, okay, the parietal layer that is in contact with the fibrous pericardium. So I'm not gonna probably ask you so many details of the pericardium. Just want you to remember there is a cavity, okay? Remember the cavity, the pericardial cavity, and that there are several layers, components to the pericardium itself. Okay, so no matter what, the heart is suspended and surrounded by this cavity filled with fluid. Now, then if we move in, okay, we will, so the pericardium is in contact with the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, is in contact with basically here the actual heart tissue, which is of course the myocardium, is cardiac muscle tissue, which is a very unique type of muscle tissue. And here is another picture to show you. This is the myocardium, is the muscle tissue, the cardiac muscle, and here shows you the epicardium, which is basically it's called epicardium. It's the same as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Is also known as epicardium. It's basically made of connective tissue and fat. And then here there is another layer. Really, that's the last layer, and contact with the cavity. The ventricle, for instance, ventricle cavity, is the endocardium, which is again connective tissue. Now, so we're going to focus on the myocardium because that's the part that really contracts, right? That's the myocardium that contracts and is able to, therefore, creates a pressure for blood movement. And so we're talking about cardiac muscle tissue. I showed these very slides into my MP1, and we need to be acquainted with the histology of cardiac muscle tissue, which is pretty different from, similar but pretty different from the skeletal muscle tissue. It's similar because it is striated, just like the skeletal muscle. But it's pretty distinct because generally the cells are single nucleated. Sometimes you may have a double nucleated cell, binucleated cell, as shown here. And this is also a difference with the skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. And very distinctively, you can see these areas here. These are known as intercalated disc. I have it spelled in the next slide. And these are very important areas because we will see what we find in these areas in a minute. Now, I just want to make sure you know that the cardiac muscle tissue is an involuntary, of course, type of muscle tissue, as we will see, is intrinsically controlled by the heart's pacemaker. I'll see what this is. It's striated, it's branched. Just see how there are branches that put in communication, seeing what the various cells. And so the cardiac muscle tissue is controlled by regions of the brainstem and the hypothalamus. And the neural control allows heart to, of course, respond to bodily needs, because, of course, there are moments where you need to pump the heart more strongly, faster. And the hormones, the specific hormones to regulate these are adrenaline and noradrenaline, known also as epinephrine and norepinephrine. And next, I want to show you how the cardiac muscle cells form what is known as electrical syncytium. Okay, this syncytium refers to the fact that, remember those intercalated discs that I was mentioning before, they stain darker. These are the points of connection between the various cardiac cells. Okay, sorry, I'm scanning with lines. And it's important to know what's happening in these intercalated discs. Okay, shown also here. This is the membrane of one cell, this is the membrane of another. What's happening there is that there are gap junctions. Remember what the gap junctions are? Gap junctions are simply channels that span through from one cell to another and put in communication the cells. And so there are all these channels here in the intercalated disc, which are the gap junctions, which allow the cardiac muscle cells to communicate electrically with one another instantly, and so that there is an exchange and a travel of ions very quickly. And of course, this is super important because cardiac muscle cells have to contract all together, all at once. All right, so I think I'm going to stop here because we're going to talk about the heart's pacemaker, okay, and all the conducting system of the heart, how it works. And I want to show you this very interesting video next time we see each other, where we're going to talk more about what's happening and the physiology of the heart contraction. Okay, so I'm going to stop it here. And as I said, next time we see each other, hopefully there won't be any internet issues. I will go ahead and continue with this. It's going to be a little bit intense. We're going to talk about action potentials again, and compare and contrast the action potential that happens in the, how it happens in the cardiac muscle tissue versus skeletal muscle tissue. And so if you can, for me, go ahead and review what an action potential is, and the curve, and the various phases for the skeletal muscle tissue that we studied at MP1. That will help you follow me in the next presentation. All right, I'll see you guys on Monday the 8th. Thank you.